Mira Murati, OpenAI's former CTO, just dropped a 975 billion parameter model called Inkling. And instead of locking it behind an API, her new lab uploaded the open weights directly to Hugging Face, totally free under an Apache 2.0 license. Which sounds incredible, until you realize that self-hosting a nearly 1 trillion parameter behemoth requires hardware most of us don't exactly have lying around. So what digit locally is basically impossible. We need to figure out who this is actually for, and whether the promise that you can own it is real or just marketing. What they actually dropped onto the internet to back up that promise is Inkling, a massive multimodal beast trained on 45 trillion tokens, spanning text, images, audio, and video. And it boasts a context window of up to 1 million tokens. If you're looking at that 975 billion parameter count and sweating, don't panic just yet, because the model is built on a sliding window mixture of experts architecture. Out of the 256 routed experts sitting inside it, only 6 are actually consulted for any given token. This means that during inference, only about 41 billion parameters are actually active at a time. So you're really just firing up a tiny sliver of the brain to get your output. The thing that actually makes it feel like a genuine frontier scale artifact is the level of engineering control you get over it. You don't just have to accept whatever it blindly spits out, because they added a controllable thinking effort dial that ranges from 0.00 up to 0.99, which lets you manually trade raw compute time for higher accuracy on a per request basis. They also slipped in a preview of Inkling-Small, a much lighter sibling with just 12 billion active parameters, for those of us who don't run our own data center. This is the kind of deliberate, heavy-duty architecture that labs normally lock securely behind an expensive API. But here, it's just sitting in a public repo waiting for you to download it. 975 billion parameters is a massive footprint. So the obvious question is how good this thing actually is when you put it to work. It debuted at 41 on the Artificial Analysis Intelligence Index, landing exactly 3 points above Nemotron 3 Ultra. That makes it the new leading American open weights model at release, which is a massive deal if you care about where your foundation models come from. But Thinking Machines is actually being surprisingly realistic about what they shipped. In their official launch post, they explicitly state that Inkling is not the strongest overall model available today, open or closed. They just wrote that down themselves, meaning the admission is a very deliberate, measured piece of positioning. They know they built the best American open base model, and they're fully aware it's deliberately not the strongest model on Earth. Which is probably why they're so careful with the phrasing, because the headline benchmark numbers really do look spectacular at first glance, like a 97.1% on AIM. It also pulled an 87.2 on GPQA Diamond. But you've got to read the fine print on their launch post, because those are Thinking Machine's own vendor-reported numbers. And if you look closely, they were measured at maximum thinking effort. It's always a good idea to bring a healthy dose of skepticism to any lab marking their own homework, especially when the compute dial gets maxed out. Because from what people are reporting in early hands-on tests, Inkling's currently trailing GLM 5.2 on agentic workflows, and it falls slightly behind Kimi K2.6 on a few multimodal tasks. So if it's getting edged out by models you can already download, why does an American lab releasing open weights even count as news? The reality of mid-2026 is that the entire top tier of the open ecosystem is Chinese, and American labs have basically been looking up at giants they didn't build. If you wanted to run a truly frontier-scale base model locally over the last year, you were stuck choosing between DeepSeek v4, GLM 5.2, Kimi, or Qwen. And while that's great for independent developers, it creates a massive headache for enterprises, meaning a lot of these institutions have just been running Chinese weights and hoping compliance doesn't ask too many questions. That's exactly why the enterprise press immediately framed Inkling as a much-needed US alternative in open-weight AI for sensitive deployments. Because for them, the provenance of the model is the entire point. You could see this exact relief hit the community reaction threads within hours of the launch, because the gap in the market was widely felt by anyone trying to ship commercial products. Inkling's real achievement as the first credible American entry in this tier is just filling a seat that had been embarrassingly empty. It's sitting right there on Hugging Face. But the real question is whether you can actually run a near trillion parameter model yourself. On paper, the open source ecosystem was completely ready for this thing to drop. You had immediate day zero support in llama.cpp for local inference, which means the community was already wiring this up before the files even finished downloading. And if you wanted to serve it, frameworks like vLLM and SGLang were basically waiting at the door. The exact same goes for Unsloth if you wanted to start fine-tuning. But having the software support doesn't change the hardware reality, and from what people are reporting, the compute requirements here are brutal. Even if you heavily quantize the model, community builds are measuring roughly 300 gigabytes of RAM just to load it. And if you want to run the full BF16 checkpoint the way it shipped, you're going to need terabytes of GPU VRAM. We've all watched people trick massive 744 B-class models onto regular laptops before, but this is not that story, and nobody's Mac is invited to this party. So that first clause of the promise, that you can actually own it, does survive with an asterisk. A company can genuinely self-host this and keep their data private, but as an individual, the sheer hardware bill relocates your ownership from your desk to a server rack. So if actually running the thing means managing a small data center, you have to wonder what possessing the weights is genuinely for. The core value is the base layer itself, because open weights give you the one thing a closed API contractually prohibits, which is true weight level control. When you have the physical artifact, you can crack it open to inspect what's inside, audit its exact behavior for enterprise compliance, and most importantly, permanently alter it to fit your exact workflow. Thinking Machines designed the release for this exact loop, shipping the model alongside their companion fine-tuning platform, Tinker, which means you can start hacking it into a narrow specialist using standard tools like Unsloth. And just to prove how well this works, the official launch demo literally featured the lab having Inkling write its own fine-tuning job, execute the training run on Tinker, and evaluate the results itself, which feels like we're just letting the AI build its own replacement, but I guess that's the job now. The strategic trade on offer is that you willingly give up a few points of general capability for a foundation that you can aggressively train on your proprietary data. Because owning the model means you can actually change the model. And that is the one thing renting will never give you. So if you don't have a spare server rack in your garage to run the thing locally, why does the free model cost real money the moment you actually try to use it? Because practically speaking, your only option is to rent it through an API from someone else. And right now, exactly 2 third-party providers actually host it, which includes Together AI and OpenRouter, plus the lab's own Tinker platform. And this is where the business model becomes visible. Because if you check the live price tracker today, renting Inkling costs $1 per million input tokens and $4.05 per million output. That output rate is roughly 4 times what you'd pay for comparable open weights models on the exact same page, which turns the open source gift into a beautifully executed trap. The catch is that the weights are just the giveaway, while the hosting and the fine-tuning rails are the product you end up paying for. So the word free only applies to the license, because for most users, the open model is still a rented model, and the meter runs at closed model rates. So the verdict on whether you can actually own this thing really just comes down to who you are. Because if you're an enterprise team with a rack budget and a highly regulated workflow, the answer is genuinely yes. But for the rest of us building things at home, the honest translation is that someone can own it. And that still matters, because a strong American base model existing at all completely resets what closed vendors can get away with charging you. And that is Mira Murati's exact bet here. which is basically that her old employer wants to rent you one giant model that does everything, while her new lab gives you the rails to take a free base and turn it into a specialist. If you are holding out for something that actually fits on your machine, what you really want to watch is Inkling-Small, which only uses 12 billion active parameters and is the version a normal person could actually hold without melting their hardware once the full weights drop. So the title survives with just one edit, because this really is the free 975 billion parameter model that someone can own. And knowing who that someone is tells you exactly what AI's next fight is actually about. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.